There's a moment in the Sister Wives archive, and if you have watched this show long enough, you know exactly the kind of moment I'm talking about, where someone says something so generous, so warm, so full of love, that you almost forget to notice what happened after it. Robyn Brown looked into that camera and said, more than once, across more than one season, that she loved all of Kody's children equally, that they were her children too. She said it with tears. She said it with conviction. And here is the question that this video is going to sit with for the next several minutes. What does it mean when someone says all the right things, and then the evidence of what actually happened tells a completely different story? That question has a name in this family, and that name is truly Brown. If this is your first time on this channel, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what we do here is go through the receipts, not the gossip, not the speculation, the actual documented on-camera season-by-season receipts. And today's receipts are some of the most uncomfortable this show has ever quietly handed us. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to make you feel nostalgic, but because the beginning is where the irony lives. Season 1. Robyn Brown enters this family, and the framing around her arrival was carefully constructed, both by the show and by the family themselves. She was the fourth wife, the one who was going to complete something, bring a new energy, and Christine Brown, the woman whose daughter we are going to be talking about for the rest of this video. Christine threw Robyn a bridal shower. Think about that. The woman who would eventually pack up a truck and drive away from everything she had built over 20 years stood in a room and celebrated Robyn's arrival into her family. She welcomed her, genuinely, and at that point in the story, truly hadn't even been born yet. The damage that was coming had no face, no name, no little girl attached to it. It was just a possibility, and possibility, at the start of any story, always looks like hope. Here is where things get interesting, and here is where I want you to pay close attention, because this next part is not about a single dramatic moment. It is about something much slower and much harder to see while it is happening. Power in the Brown family did not shift overnight. It drifted. Season by season, confessional by confessional, the emotional center of gravity in this family began moving, and it moved in one direction. If you go back and look at the confessional distribution across the first 10 seasons, and fans have done this work meticulously in forums and comment sections and documented analyses by around season 10, Robyn was receiving more individual confessional time than Christine and Janelle combined. Now, you might say that is just editing. And you would be partially right, but editing reflects reality. Producers film what is happening, and what was happening was that Kody Brown's emotional investment, his attention, his processing, his center had migrated. And Christine's household, Christine's children, truly included, were feeling that migration in real time, not as a concept, as a daily experience of a father who was somewhere else, even when he was technically present. This is the part where we have to talk about performance versus action, because Robyn Brown, on camera, was extraordinary at performance. The tears were real, or they looked real enough that the distinction barely matters for this conversation. Every family conflict, every blow-up, every moment of tension, Robyn cried. She expressed love. She said the words that a person who genuinely cared would say. But here is the distinction that this entire video hinges on. Performance is not the same as intervention, and the question that has never been answered satisfactorily across 15+ seasons of this show is this. When Kody Brown began reducing his presence in Christine's home, when those visits started getting shorter and less frequent, when Truly started going longer stretches without her father showing up, what did Robyn do to change that? What did she say, behind the cameras, in the home where Kody was spending most of his time, to advocate for a 7-year-old girl who had no power in this situation and no voice that Kody was choosing to listen to? The documented answer, and I want to be precise here because precision matters, is that nothing Robyn did, on or off camera, produced a meaningful change in Kody's presence in Truly's life. Whatever was said, whatever conversations may have happened, the outcome tells us the weight of those conversations. And the outcome was a little girl whose father kept not coming. Now we arrive at the moment that is impossible to reframe, no matter how sympathetic your interpretation of Robyn Brown is. COVID. The quarantine protocols. This is not a moment where anyone has to read between lines or connect distant dots, because Kody Brown himself connected them on camera. The rules. The famous, extensively documented, widely discussed quarantine rules that effectively ended Kody's rotation between homes were developed in consultation with Robyn. Kody said so. It is in the episodes. The rules that meant Truly went from an already reduced father presence to something close to zero. Those rules were written in the house that Kody never left, and when those rules were announced and enforced, the homes that could not or would not comply with Christine's home, Janelle's home, became functionally cut off. And Truly Brown woke up one day and the rotation had stopped. The visits had stopped, and the version of her father that showed up when he did was a version that had clearly made his priorities visible in a way that no child should ever have to interpret on her own. Here is the angle that I genuinely believe has been sitting in plain sight and has never been directly addressed with the specificity it deserves. Robyn Brown's children, the children she brought into this marriage from her previous relationship, already had experience with a complicated biological father dynamic. Robyn navigated that. She understood, from a position of lived experience and not theory, what it looks like when children have a fractured relationship with a father figure. She had watched her own kids process that complexity. She had been present for those conversations. She knew what that particular damage looks like up close, in a child's eyes, in a child's behavior, in the questions a child asks at night. Which means that when the same dynamic began developing for Truly, when the signs were there, when the pattern was visible, Robyn Brown was not operating from ignorance. She was not someone who could look back and say she did not recognize what was happening because she had never seen it before. She had a front row seat to exactly that story in her own children's lives, and Truly still ended up in the same narrative. That is not a coincidence that can be passed over quickly. That is something that deserves to be sat with. The deepest layer of this, and this is the part that I think explains why so many viewers have felt frustrated and unsatisfied with the post-divorce commentary from the Brown family, is what I would call the narrative protection layer. After the family publicly fractured, after Christine left, after everything became undeniable, the dominant framing that emerged, including from Robyn, was a both sides framing. The collapse was positioned as a collective failure, a tragedy that happened to the whole family, something everyone contributed to in equal measure. And on the surface, that framing sounds mature. It sounds like someone who has processed their grief and arrived at a place of nuanced understanding. But here is what that framing does functionally. It distributes responsibility so broadly that no individual accountability survives. When everything is everyone's fault equally, then nothing is any specific person's responsibility specifically, and the casualty of that framing is that the person whose specific, individual, documentable experience gets buried under the general wreckage is Truly Brown, a child who did not choose this situation, did not have equal agency in its creation, and whose relationship with her father has a traceable, specific, episodically documented decline that does not survive a both sides reading. Robyn's narrative protects Robyn, and it does not protect Truly. I want to acknowledge something here because this channel is not about demonizing anyone, and that distinction matters to me. The SisterWives fandom has had a complicated relationship with criticism of Robyn Brown for years. The "so-been" label, the intensity of the negative commentary, some of it has gone to places that are genuinely unfair, that are more about projection than evidence. And I am not interested in that version of this conversation. What I am interested in is the documented pattern, the actual on-camera evidence across multiple seasons, the things that were said by the people involved, in their own words, that we can reference and evaluate without editorializing. And when you look at that documented pattern, the shift in confessional weight, the consolidation of Kody's emotional presence in one household, the COVID protocols and their acknowledged origin, the absence of any effective intervention in Truly's deteriorating relationship with her father, the conclusion that this audience arrived at years ago holds up. The audience was not wrong. The "so-been" criticism, at its most substantive and evidence-based, was pointing at something real. They were early, and Truly Brown's story is the most specific and most human evidence of what that pattern cost in real terms. I want to pause here for a moment before we go any further and ask you something directly, because I have been laying out this case methodically, and I think you deserve a moment to sit with it before the second half of this video goes somewhere even more specific. The question I want you to carry into the break is this. When you watch Robyn Brown in those early seasons, declaring love for all of Kody's children, and then you watch what actually happened to Truly's relationship with her father, what is the word you reach for? Is it deliberate? Is it passive? Is it something more complicated that does not fit into either of those categories cleanly? Because I am going to tell you what I think in part 2. And I am going to tell you what I believe happens next, because the story between Robyn Brown and Truly Brown is not finished. There is a moment coming that this show, or social media, or some intersection of both is going to deliver to us eventually. And based on every pattern this family has established across 15 years of documented behavior, that moment is going to be very revealing. Part 2 is where we get into the prediction, and the prediction is one I have a high degree of confidence in. Stay with me. We have established the timeline. We have established the confessional shift. We have established the COVID protocol origin. We have established that Robyn Brown, of all the people in this family's orbit, had the most personal, the most experiential, the most visceral understanding of what a fractured father relationship does to children. She had lived it, not read about it, not watched it from a distance, lived it, in her own household with her own children, before she ever became a Brown. And we have established that none of that personal knowledge translated into any documented, outcome-producing intervention on behalf of Truly. Now I want to go somewhere that requires us to distinguish between two very different things, because the distinction is everything in this conversation. There is a difference between causing harm and failing to prevent harm, and in the context of Truly Brown's story, both of those categories deserve to be examined separately, because they carry different moral weight, and they produce different conclusions. Did Robyn Brown cause Kody's emotional withdrawal from Christine's household? The honest answer is not unilaterally. Kody Brown is an adult man who made choices. His withdrawal from Christine, his reduced presence with her children, his eventual complete exit from that relationship, those are his choices and his responsibility at their foundation. Nobody put a geographic fence around Robyn's house and forced Kody to stay inside it. He chose where his time went. He chose which relationships he invested in and which ones he allowed to atrophy. That is on Kody. Fully and specifically on Kody. And any version of this conversation that tries to move all of the responsibility from Kody to Robyn is doing something intellectually dishonest that this channel is not interested in. But, and this is the but that the entire video has been building toward, there is a second question. And the second question is the one that Robyn's defenders have been most successful at avoiding, because it is harder to dismiss than the first one. Did Robyn Brown use the position she occupied, the position of the wife who had Kody's ear, who had his daily presence, who had consolidated the emotional headquarters of this family within her walls? Did she use that position to advocate for Truly? Did she use her access, her influence, her proximity to the man making these choices to push back? To say, this child is suffering, this is visible, this is documentable, and you need to be in her life in a way that actually counts? And the answer to that question, across 15 seasons of a show that was capturing this family's life with a level of documentary access that most families never experience, the answer is no. Not in any way that produced results. Not in any way that reversed the pattern. Not in any way that gave Truly back the father's presence that was being steadily withdrawn. That is not the same as causing it. But it is not nothing. And in a situation involving a child, a specific child, a young girl who had no mechanism to advocate for herself within the power structure of this family, failing to use available influence is its own category of failure. Not evil, not monstrous, but not innocent either. And the tendency to collapse that distinction, to say that because Robyn did not personally drive Kody away from Christine's house, she bears no responsibility for what happened inside it, that tendency is exactly what has allowed this conversation to stay comfortable for too long. Now let me bring in the layer that I mentioned in part 1, and I want to give it the full treatment it deserves, because I think it is the most psychologically complex piece of this entire puzzle. Robyn Brown's children, Aurora, Dayton, and Brianna, came into this marriage with the weight of a previous family structure already on them. Their biological father, David Jessup, was not a consistent presence in the way that a child ideally experiences a father. Robyn navigated that. She made choices about how to talk to her children about that absence, or that complexity. She sat with those conversations. She watched Kody step into a stepfather role for those children, And she observed firsthand what it means for a child to have that kind of relationship repaired or supplemented by a present, invested male figure. She knew what it felt like, from a mother's perspective, to watch your child reach for a father relationship and have that reach either answered or not answered. She had that emotional knowledge encoded in her. It was not abstract for her, the way it might be abstract for someone who had never watched their child navigate that specific pain, which is why, and I want to say this as precisely as I can, which is why the trajectory of Truly's relationship with Kody is so impossible to explain away as simple unawareness on Robyn's part. You cannot have the experience Robyn had with her own children and then be genuinely blind to the same pattern developing in the household next door, or down the street, or wherever Christine's home was relative to Robyn's in whatever city the family was living in that season. The pattern is recognizable to anyone, but especially to someone who has already watched it happen once from the inside. And this is where the word that keeps circling this conversation finally has to be said directly. The word is complicity. Not conspiracy, not calculated cruelty, complicity, which is quieter than both of those things, and more common, and in many ways more damaging because it is so easy to excuse and so hard to prosecute. Complicity is what happens when someone has the knowledge, has the access, has the relational capital to intervene and chooses, consciously or otherwise, not to spend that capital on someone else's child. Complicity does not require intention. It only requires inaction in the presence of awareness. And the case for Robyn's awareness is at this point overwhelming. I want to talk about what comes next, because this story is not finished. The SisterWives franchise is still alive in some form. Social media has given every member of this family a direct line to their audience. And the relational dynamics between Robyn and Christine's children, including Truly, are going to continue developing in public, whether anyone plans for that or not. Here is my prediction, and I want to be transparent about the confidence level I am assigning to this. It is high. Not because I have inside information, but because behavioral patterns, once established across 15 years of documented evidence, are the most reliable predictors available. Robyn Brown will, within the next 2 to 3 years, make a visible, public attempt to reconnect with or acknowledge Truly Brown in some way. It may come through the show, if any version of it continues. It may come through social media, a birthday post, a comment on one of Christine's updates, something that signals warmth and continued love across the divide. It may come at a family event, one of the older children's weddings, a graduation, some milestone occasion where the family's various factions are in the same physical space, and the cameras, formal or informal, are present. And when that moment comes, it will be framed as an olive branch. It will be received by a portion of the audience as evidence of Robyn's genuine love, her attempt to maintain connection despite the family's fracture, proof that she never stopped caring about Christine's kids. The media coverage, whatever form the media takes, in 2 to 3 years will be significant. It will trend. It will generate the kind of engagement that this family has always generated when its emotional storylines reach visible inflection points. But here is what that moment will actually be. It will be a test, the most revealing test this story has to offer. Because Truly Brown is not a child anymore. She is growing into someone who has her own memories, her own experience, her own fully formed perception of what happened in her family, and who was present for it and who was not. She is growing into someone who will eventually have the emotional vocabulary and the personal authority to respond to an olive branch on her own terms, rather than on the terms of the adults around her. And what Truly does in that moment, whether she receives it, whether she rejects it, whether she meets it with warmth or with the particular kind of quiet that a person produces when they are being polite about something they have not forgiven, that response will tell us everything. Not about Robyn, about what Truly experienced, about what Truly carries, about what it actually cost to be Christine Brown's daughter in the Brown family during the years when Kody Brown was choosing where to be, and Robyn Brown was the gravitational center of those choices. The audience has been watching this family for 15 years. They have watched the weddings and the moves and the arguments and the crying confessionals and the therapy sessions and the birthday parties and the graduations. They have watched Robyn cry for this family more times than most people cry in a lifetime. They have watched Christine build a life on the other side of the decision to leave. They have watched Janelle navigate her own version of the same collapse. They have watched the older children speak their truths in interviews and on social media, with a specificity that the show itself was never willing to produce. And every single thread of this story, every single one, eventually leads back to the same central, unresolved question, which is, what was Robyn Brown actually doing while all of this was happening? Not on camera, not in confessionals, in the daily, undocumented private architecture of a family that she occupied the center of. That question does not have a clean answer. It may never have a clean answer, but the evidence that surrounds it, the documented pattern, the confessional weight, the COVID protocols, the lived experience she brought into the marriage that made unawareness impossible, that evidence is no longer avoidable. The audience that has been sitting with this discomfort for years was not wrong. They were reading something real, and Truly Brown's story is the place where that reading becomes undeniable. Truly did not get a say in this family structure. She did not choose the circumstances of her parents' marriage. She did not choose which home her father spent his time in. She did not choose the protocols that governed his access to her during the years when a father's presence is not optional, it is formative. She got the consequences of other people's choices, and one of those people, specifically, had both the knowledge and the proximity to make different choices on her behalf. And the record shows that she did not. That is the conclusion. Not that Robyn Brown is a villain. Life is not organized around villains. It is organized around people making self-interested choices in complex situations, and calling those choices something more flattering than what they actually are. Robyn Brown made choices that served Robyn Brown's household, Robyn Brown's children, and Robyn Brown's marriage. That is human. That is understandable in a cold, clinical way, but it is not the same as the love she declared on camera. And Truly Brown is the specific, individual, irreplaceable proof of that gap. Remember the opening line of this video? Robyn Brown said that Truly was her daughter too. She said it with tears. She said it with conviction. Hold that image in your mind. Now, hold it next to the documented timeline of Truly's relationship with her father, across the same years that Robyn was making those declarations. And tell me in the comments, right now, with complete honesty, whether those two images can exist in the same story without something between them needing to be named. Here is what I want from you at the end of this video. I want you to drop one word in the comments. Just one word. The word that you think most accurately describes Robyn Brown's role in Truly's story. Not a sentence, not a paragraph, one word. I want to see what this audience, after everything laid out in this video, reaches for. Because those words, collectively, are going to tell us something about where this conversation is actually standing right now. Not where the show wants it to stand, not where Robyn's social media presence wants it to stand, but where people who have been paying attention have actually arrived. If this video gave you something to think about, if it connected dots that you felt but could not fully articulate before, please like it. That one action tells the algorithm that this kind of careful, evidence-based analysis deserves to reach people who have been watching this show and feeling like the mainstream commentary has been letting them down. Because it has been letting them down. And this channel exists to be the thing that does not do that. Subscribe to SisterWives Crew. Not because of this video alone, but because this is topic 9 in a series that is building towards something. Every video in this series connects to the next one. The next video is going to season 13, and it is going to find something that has been hiding in plain sight in that season's editing that reframes a significant portion of what you thought you understood about how this family's dynamic solidified. It involves a specific sequence of episodes and a pattern in how certain conversations were cut that the fandom has never pulled apart with the level of specificity it deserves. It is the kind of thing that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The receipts are there. They have always been there. This channel is just willing to read them out loud. Truly Brown deserved better. That is not a complicated sentence. It is not a controversial one. It is just true. And the people who were in a position to give her better and did not are going to have to live with that record. The show captured it. The fans documented it. And this channel is not going to stop talking about it until the conversation catches up to what the evidence has been saying for years. I will see you in the next one.